On the 28th of October 1986, Jeremy Bamber was convicted on a 10-2 majority verdict of the murders of his mother June, father Neville, sister Sheila Caffell and her 6-year-old twin sons Daniel and Nicholas. Whilst considering the verdict, the jury posed a question about the relatives of Jeremy Bamber and, in particular, the testimony of June Bamber's brother-in-law Robert. If Jeremy Bamber was found guilty and imprisoned for many years, who would be the beneficiaries of the Bamber estates and monies? Could it be his uncle and family, a possible reason or motive for Robert Beauflower's statement about Jeremy's being able to kill his own parents? Robert Beauflower had told the jury that he was wealthy in his own right. This was a lie. He lived in a rented property and farmed land rented from Mabel Speakman, Jeremy's maternal grandmother. In response to the jury question, Robert Beauflower replied to the judge in an evasive manner, stating, "I have been taught to count my wealth in health and friends, not in LSD, pounds." Robert Beauflower also hid the fact that on the 3rd of September 1985, on Robert's request, Mabel Speakman had changed her will, removing in issue clauses effectively excluding Jeremy from her will and ensuring that Mabel Speakman's entire estate was left solely to his wife, Pamela Beauflower, June Bamber's sister. This arrangement was not only kept from the 1986 trial, it was also not a decision by any court or authority and excluded the relatives of Neville Bamber. All of this was based solely on Mabel Speakman being considered June's next of kin by Basil Cock, the executor. The inquiry did not take into consideration that the relatives, and in particular Robert Beauflower, had benefited financially from the Bamber estate as a result of Jeremy's conviction. The City of London Police made no mention in their report that Robert Beauflower's blood was an identical match for the late Sheila Caffell, Jeremy Bamber's sister, whose blood group was found in the moderator, and it is this blood group evidence which maintains the conviction. In 2002, the appeal court heard that none of Sheila's DNA was found in the sound moderator, but the appeal was lost because the court was convinced by an expert that just because Sheila's DNA was not present at that time, it didn't mean that it never was. The Bamber estate was considerable, and this video will discuss each of the assets, their values, and where they went to after the tragedies. Robert and Pamela Beauflower weren't the only peripheral family who benefited from the conviction of Jeremy Bamber. Their daughter Anne and her husband Peter Eaton ultimately gained financially, along with Anthony and Jacqueline Pargeter, who were Neville Bamber's late sister's children. It is also strongly suspected that David Beauflower, Pam and Robert's son, received a share of the estate, particularly in light of the fact that his name appears as a claimant in a legal document written during a battle between the relatives. White House Farm and Land. White House Farm is a large house with land situated in the picturesque village of Tolston Darcy, Essex. It was to become the Bamber family home within a few years of Neville and June's marriage and was rented from the Henry Smith Trust. Following Jeremy's arrest and charge with murder, Anne and Peter Eaton applied for the tenancy and in due course it was allocated to them and they still live there to this day. N&J Bamber Limited. Neville Bamber went into business with Leslie Speakman, forming the company Speakman and Bamber. Following Leslie's death in 1975, the business became N&J Bamber Limited. Neville and June were directors and Jeremy was a shareholder. In 1985, at the time of the tragedies, Neville owned 79%, June 1% and Jeremy 20% of the shares. The day after the tragedies, Basil Cock, Neville Bamber's accountant and executor of the estate, accompanied Jeremy to the solicitors, where Jeremy was made sole director of the company. Peter Eaton, Anne's husband, was entrusted as temporary manager. On the 12th of September 1985, Basil Cock illegally appointed Peter Eaton as director of the company without Jeremy's knowledge or permission. Graham Wilson, a solicitor, was named as the second director on Monday the 16th of December 1985. Also without Jeremy's permission. Following probate on the Bamber estates, Mabel Speakman then owned June and Neville Bamber's shares, whilst Jeremy retained his 20% interest. His co-directors never consulted Jeremy Bamber about any aspect of his company. Neither has he received any monetary income from N&J Bamber Limited since his arrest. Jeremy was retired as a director in 1992, fraudulently and without his knowledge. Despite being removed as a named director, Jeremy still owned his shares in the business, with Pamela and Robert Bowflower owning the remaining 80%. Between 1984 and 1988, N&J Bamber Limited made considerable average profit of £61,264, but by 1990 the business had no fixed assets, which had been valued at almost £64,000 in 1985. Based on the previous years, the company would have been expected to make around £600,000 in profit over the next 10 years, but the company made actually less than £4,000. Jeremy Bamber retained 20% of N&J Bamber Limited until 14th of September 1999, when the company was dissolved with no assets, only costs. The costs were for the process of dissolving the company, in addition to depreciation, repairs, outstanding management fees and other miscellaneous costs totalling £80,000. Jeremy Bamber received a bill from Basil Cox stating that upon liquidation, Jeremy owed almost £16,000, which constituted his 20% share of the costs of winding up the company. In 1987, Barbara Wilson made an oral complaint to D.S. Jones of Essex Police regarding the concerns that Peter Eaton was stealing from the business N&J Bamber Limited. On the 10th of June 1988, following a visit to see Barbara Wilson, an internal report was made by D.I. Smith of the Fraud Squad, and a statement was taken over the course of several days from her. In it, she discussed what, in her words, amounted to various acts of dishonesty have taken place involving the way Peter Eaton has managed the estate.
Peter Eaton, in my opinion, appears to use every opportunity as manager of N&J Bamber Limited to obtain whatever financial gain possible, including appearing to be dishonest against the estate. Regardless to his apparent dishonesty, he is not running the estate in a way one would expect, so much so that the value of N&J Bamber Limited must have suffered. Shortly after taking up the post of managing N&J Bamber Limited, Peter Eaton sold off as scrap numerous items of farm machinery for the apparent sum of £80. It is suggested the value was far in excess of £80. Various people have commented on the apparent dishonest act. N&J Bamber Limited had a combine harvester. This was sold off to an unknown purchaser when it would appear to have been in good working order. As such, a necessary machine required for the efficient running of N&J Bamber was not available. N&J Bamber Limited supplied local traders with potatoes. It was normal practice for cash on delivery, with the money being paid to the secretary, then all money was correctly accounted for. As no monies were being paid in, a bill was sent to one such customer who stated that she had paid Peter Eaton in cash. The monies had not been paid into N&J Bamber. In addition, it appears O.C. Road Campsite Shop has been supplied a substantial amount of potatoes by N&J Bamber. The amount outstanding is £2,000 or in the region thereof. Various farmers formed the North Malden Growers. Mr. Neville Bamber was the manager of the association. Hedge cutting and clearance was done by the association, hiring out labour and machinery from the group. However, since Peter Eaton has managed the estate, this has been done by Bernard Appleton, for £2,000 per annum, which is grossly in excess of previous expenses incurred by the Bamber estate. By use of his position, discounts appear to have been obtained, with the financial gain going to Eton as opposed to the Bamber estate. Such dealings with Eastern County farmers, Eastern has no shares, thus not entitled to deal through them. Likewise, Billericay Farm Services carry out spraying. It is suspected by me that Eton is obtaining discounts rightly due to the Bamber estate. Various occasions where goods have been wrongly delivered to either Eton's farm or to the Bamber estate, which give rise to suspicion that Bamber estate may be paying for certain goods to go direct to Eton. Also, deliveries of goods such as corn, wheat, pea seeds, etc. Eton often claims part of the load, yet Bamber estate appears to pay the bill. In day-to-day running, it appears Bamber estate manpower has been used for work on Eton's farm. In effect, the estate is paying for work to be done for Eton. Peter Eton arranged for the nearly new engine of Bamber's tractor to be put in Eton's tractor, and the inferior engine of Eton's to be put in the Bamber estate tractor. The tractors were then subject to sale via DOEs, thus depriving the estate. Originally, N&J Bamber Limited included cattle. These have since been sold off, with Eton now renting a herd from Litravit. Also purchasing straw and hay. This does not make financial sense. Why rent a herd? Why buy in straw and hay when it is produced by N&J Bamber? Eton was entrusted to sell Jeremy Bamber's Astra motor car for approximately £6,000. The cheques of payment did not appear to add up. Peter Eton was approached about the discrepancy by me, and some while later produced £500 to go into the estate funds.
This once lucrative business, N&J Bamber Limited, was virtually run into the ground. Profits became almost non-existent and assets disappeared. Jeremy Bamber was not contacted regarding any of the decisions Peter Eton made, and no one protected Jeremy's share of the company, which he owned independently of any inheritance. The fraud squad delayed any action on their investigations, as Jeremy had an appeal pending. By the time the appeal finished, the matter was forgotten, and no charges were brought against Peter Eton, and he was never investigated for fraud. Osey Road Caravan Site. Osey Road Caravan Site, situated on the banks of the River Blackwater, was established in 1933 by Mabel Speakman. It consisted of a 20-acre site and had 500 caravan plots by 1985. The ownership was split between the family, June and Pamela owning 42% shares each, with Jeremy Bamber and Anne Eaton each owning 8%. Following Jeremy's arrest, June Bamber's shares were owned by Mabel Speakman, and the remaining shareholders maintained their share totals. Upon the death of Mabel, Pamela Bowflower then owned 84% of the business. In 2004, Pamela bought Jeremy's 8% share from him, and after legal costs, he received £12,000 to £14,000, which included monies from the sale of Jeremy's caravan site shares and the sale of his interest in Oakfield and Pylon Field. Today the business is still owned by Pamela and Anne, and Jenny Robinson, Anne's daughter, is the director. Additional field next to the caravan park. This additional field was bought and owned exclusively by June Bamber. It consisted of 6 acres of land and had 50 caravan plots. In 1985, this land obtained the valuation of £47,500. As with most of the other assets, Mabel Speakman initially inherited this property, and upon her death, Pamela and Robert Bowflower benefited. This land is currently owned by Pamela Bowflower, with Anne Eaton's daughter Janie Robinson acting as a director. Oakfield and Pylon Fields. June, Neville and Jeremy purchased an estimated 48 acres of land known as Oakfield and Pylon Field, which had formerly been part of an estate known as Little Renter's Farm. The three family members held equal shares which had a value of £45,600 in 1985. Following Jeremy's arrest, Neville and June's interest in the land went to Mabel Speakman, and following her death in 1986, Anne and Peter Eaton and Jeremy owned a third of this land each. In 2004, Pamela Bowflower bought Jeremy's land as part of a combined deal with its Osey Road Caravan Park share. It is assumed ownership continues to this date by Pamela Bowflower and Anne and Peter Eaton. Charity Farm 50 acres. Charity Farm was purchased by Neville and June Bamber, and in 1985 its value totalled £45,600. Following Jeremy's arrest, Mabel Speakman took ownership and, upon her death, Pamela and Robert Bowflower held the deeds. It is believed that the land is still farmed by Peter Eaton. Hyams Farm. Hyams Farm, Essex, was made up of 320 acres of land, of which June Bamber owned around 18%. In 1985, the value of June's share amounted to £48,000. In 2003, Hyams Farm sold for £673,500 and was sold by Thomas Howie and George Bunting, who were both related to Mabel Speakman. The property and land were initially inherited by Mabel Speakman, but ownership passed to Thomas Howie and George Bunting, although it is not known when the farm was inherited by them or if they had to fight the Bowflowers for the claim to this farm. 50 acres of land between Little Totham and Tolsant Major. Neville Bamber purchased these 50 acres of land in secret from Peter Eaton's brother John for Anne and Peter Eaton to farm. The jury didn't know anything about this, and neither did Jeremy until documents surfaced from the 1986 Dickinson investigation. The Eatons continued farming this land upon the death of Mabel Speakman, then inherited the land. It is unknown if they still farm these 50 acres of land or if they have ever been sold. 9 Head Street Goldhanger. Jeremy moved into this cottage after Neville and June Bamber purchased it for him. In 1985 its value was £10,000. Mabel Speakman inherited this property from the Bamber estate. Later it passed to Robert and Pamela Bowflower. The cottage was subsequently sold, and records from a sale in 2013 show its value at £295,000, although land registry records confirm it was not sold by the Bowflowers in 2013. Thus, the sale they commissioned happened at a previous time, but the date of this sale is unknown. This was the apartment in affluent Maida Vale, and was purchased by Neville and June for Sheila to live in, with the twins at a cost of £10,000. Mabel and then Pamela inherited this property, but we cannot be certain when the Bowflowers sold this property or the amount it sold for, but a sale was recorded in 2016 for £700,000. Vaulty Manor Farm. The early medieval farmhouse known as Vaulty Manor was situated across the road from Osey Road Caravan Park. Mabel Speakman tenanted the property, making it her home, and in 1985 Neville Bamber was farming the land. Following Jeremy's arrest and Peter Eaton's appointment as manager of N&J Bamber Limited, he took over farming Vaulty Manor. Upon Mabel's death in 1986, Pamela Bowflower held the tenancy, and eventually Anne Eaton purchased this asset from the owners. After the trial, Anne Eaton took ownership and converted her grandmother's home into a wedding venue. Vaulty Manor remains a lucrative wedding business today, and Anne Eaton's daughter Janie is the current director. Carbonell's Farm, House and Land. Mabel Speakman owned this farm, and Robert and Pamela Bowflower rented it, although Robert inferred in his evidential statement that he owned it pre-trial in order to make the jury believe that he was a wealthy man in his own right. This was not true. After Jeremy's arrest, Mabel initially continued to rent the farmland to Robert and Pamela, with Robert continuing to farm the crops there. However, Pamela and Robert Bowflower took ownership prior to Mabel's death to avoid having to pay death duties. The farmhouse and land is still owned by Pamela Barflower. Gardener's Farm. The same people who owned Vaulty Manor owned Gardener's Farm and, in 1985, Neville Bamber farmed it. Following Jeremy Bamber's arrest, Peter Eaton took over farming. It was purchased by Anne and Peter Eaton at the same time they bought Vaulty Manor. Gardener's Farm sold in 2009 for £200,000, although it is not specified if the Eatons still farmed the associated land. Clifton House Apartments, Guildford. Clifton House was a magnificent manor house owned by Neville Bamber's parents, Beatrice and Herbert. Following their deaths, this property was divided in equal shares to Neville Bamber, Anthony Pargeter, and his sister Jacqueline Wood. The manor house was converted into flats, some of which were still being completed in 1985. The value of Neville's interest in 1985 was £62,727. Following the tragedies, Mabel Speakman received Neville's share, and subsequently this went to Pamela and Robert Bowflower. In 1991, Anthony Pargeter and Jacqueline Wood brought a civil litigation against the Bowflowers for their share of the Bamber estate and eventually settled out of court, taking Neville's assets. Peter and Anne Eaton and David and Karen Bowflower retained June Bamber's estate. Ownership of Clifton House was transferred to Anthony and Jackie between 1997 and 2000. The flats had sold for an estimated total of £951,000. Had Jeremy not been convicted, he would stood to have inherited Neville Bamber's one-third share. Monies due from estate of Beatrice Bamber. Probate documents show that in 1985 loans had been made by the late Beatrice Bamber which were outstanding and totalling £61,152 owed to her estate. It appears this would be Neville Bamber's share of the owed monies. It is unknown if the debts were ever collected nor whom they were paid to. Shares in North Malden Growers. Neville owned shares in a business he helped to establish called North Malden Growers. The shares are not listed in Neville's probate documents, but it is known that his shares passed to Mabel Speakman and then Robert and Pamela Bowflower. The value of the shares is unknown, and it isn't known if they were later sold. June and Neville Bamber held several bank accounts at the time of their deaths. June Bamber's accounts totalled £30,333 and Neville Bamber's £1,400. Mabel Speakman and then Pamela and Robert Bowflower then inherited this cash. Also, according to a statement by Anne just 3 days after the tragedies, she and Robert and David Bowflower let themselves into the farmhouse and searched the deceased June and Sheila's handbags and pockets looking for cash, and they removed £400 from Neville Bamber's wallet. Life insurance policy. At the time of her death, June Bamber had a life insurance policy with a value of £9,806. The policy was paid to Mabel Speakman, and the remainder of the monies from it ultimately went to Pamela and Robert after Mabel's death. Personal chattels, jewellery, vehicles, artwork. Neville and June owned many personal chattels, including pieces of art, vehicles and items of jewellery which, at the time of their deaths, Neville Bamber's share totalled to £20,000 and June Bamber's share was £10,000. These items were initially inherited by Mabel Speakman and, upon her death, became assets belonging to Pamela and Robert Bowflower. However, according to Anne's statements, long before Mabel's death and only 2 days after the tragedies, Anne, Robert and David obtained the keys to the farmhouse and stripped the property of jewellery and other family heirlooms, despite Jeremy's refusal to allow anything to be removed. Similarly, June Bamber had specified that she did not want her wedding and engagement ring removed from her hand if she should die. However, according to police documents, both the wedding and engagement rings were taken from her hand during the post-mortem, and Anne received these rings from D.S. Davidson of Essex Police. Debenture shares in Tesco stores purchased in 1957. Mabel Speakman owned £10,000 of shares for Tesco stores in 1985, which made up part of her estate. Upon her death, Pamela and Robert Bowflower inherited these shares. The Bamber and Speakman estates and assets amounted to a huge total. Mabel Speakman inherited all of the Bamber estate, and upon her death in 1986, Pamela Bowflower solely inherited both the Bamber and Speakman estates. Robert Bowflower had ensured that by persuading Mabel to change her will exclusively in the interests of his wife Pamela, that Jeremy would effectively be disinherited. If the jury had been given an honest answer to their question about who would inherit upon Jeremy's conviction, would they have viewed the relatives' testimony against Jeremy as unmotivated?